Are you ready to push the boundaries of performance mentally, physically, and everywhere in between? Welcome to the Too Fit podcast, where the two fit guys uncover the tips, tools, and tactics from elite performers in the fields of health, nutrition, athletics, and business that will set you up for success, deliver results, and help you on your journey to becoming too fit. Now, let's get started with your hosts, Jake and Josh, the Two Fit Guys.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Too Fit podcast. And today's guest is none other than Stephen Kotler.
Mr. Stephen Kotler, very accomplished man. And he's about to be even more accomplished. He's about to be a New York Times bestseller, Stealing Fire.
That's right. We got the hard copy right here, early edition, and it did not disappoint. Incredible read, incredible book, just like his many others. You've probably heard of him, like Jake said. He's written, co-wrote Bold with Peter Diamandis, The Rise of Superman. What are a couple of his other works? Abundance.
The one about Rancho de Chihuahua, which shows more of part of his, not only entrepreneur side, but his empathy side. So, which is really cool. But I really love what we dive into on this podcast. It's really what he's been studying for the last decade or more. He's probably the most knowledgeable man on the subject called flow states and non-ordinary states, which we could have talked about all day. I mean, the podcast, this episode was literally one big flow state.
Yeah, it was. It was a little over an hour long, felt like it was 10 minutes. And so many questions, so many more questions that we have for Stephen, and we know you're going to have plenty as well. So we'll have to have him back on a part two, maybe a listener Q&A. So please, in the comment section, leave any questions you have for Stephen, and we'll be sure to pass them along.
Well, what do we dive into on this one? Just tease him a little bit.
Oh, man. So we really cover what is flow. What are the basics? What is flow? What are these states that he discusses in this book? There's kind of four characteristics that make up these different states of what he calls non-ordinary states of consciousness. And people from the Navy SEALs, Silicon Valley, tech founders, Wall Street are all trying to access these states of high performance. And that's really what we dive into in the book.
Yeah, how to do it, how not to do it. But really, I think the whole underlying theme when I step back and look back on it is how to get in the now, the deep now, as he calls it, which just reminds me of this quote that I know we've mentioned before, is that the only time you're ever truly happy, the only time true happiness is found is when you're in the present. If you're looking back to the past, your own past, you have a subconscious feeling of regret. When you're looking to the future, it gives you anxiety, the bills that are coming or whatever it might be. So the only time that you can truly be happy and appreciate your life is in the right now, the here, the present, the deep now.
Absolutely. Wherever you are, be all there.
That's right.
And so we cover all those techniques in this book, in this podcast from the book, and you will not be disappointed. It is incredible. Stephen's loaded with information, and we know you will enjoy it just as much as we did.
Check it out. Get that flow on.
All right, Stephen, welcome on the show.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be with you guys.
Yeah, Stephen, we're excited about this. I got to be honest, when I saw, it's been on my watch list, Stealing Fire. And I actually went to Barnes & Noble the other night, and I wasn't sure if it was out, but I went to the search desk, actually, and I typed it in. It said it was in the system. Then I go and look on the business profile section. Actually was not there. But I go and ask the lady. She goes to the back. She's searching all around. She finally gets it. I was like, yes. And ended up spending it all that night, thumbing through it and reading through it. I think it's a great read. I think people are going to get a whole lot out of it. But I want to know, what's the inspiration behind it? Why does this book exist?
Coming out of Rise of Superman, which is my book about flow states or optimal states of performance, which was primarily focused on action adventure sport athletes. We had been doing, the Flow Genome Project, the organization where we study these states, we had been working with a lot of top elite performing organizations, the military, top athletes, that sort of thing. But coming out of Rise, we found ourselves kind of all over the country. Wall Street, tech, Fortune 100 companies, tech firms, more military. And it really didn't, wherever we went, first of all, to me, the fact that I'm getting to teach flow, which is an altered state of consciousness inside institutions in the establishment, it's a little peculiar. It's new, right? It strikes me as kind of a radical and really positive development. But everywhere we went, didn't matter. People would come up to us after the talks and say things like, oh, this flow stuff is great. I've been doing a little bit. I'm going to do a lot more. But what do you think about, we've taken everybody on silent meditation retreats, or we've got teams of engineers microdosing with psychedelics, or people are using alternative sexuality practices to alter consciousness, or they're using technology to, zap their brainwaves to alter, everywhere we went. I was freaked out that we were talking about what altered state of consciousness and its impact on performance. And everywhere we went, people were using a kind of blizzard of these states to unlock performance is part A. So we noticed that. The other thing that we noticed is when I was mapping the research for flow and working with the Flow Genome Project with Jamie Wheel, my partner, we sort of had to do a giant diagram of everything that happens neurobiologically, so neurochemistry, neuroanatomy, neurophysiology, neuroelectricity, psychology, big math. And in doing it, it turned out to be something of a Rosetta Stone for all these states of consciousness. And what we've learned, not that this is new, 100 years ago, William James, Harvard psychologist, philosopher, said, hey, wait a minute, it looks like meditative states, contemplative states, psychedelic states, flow states, sexuality trigger states, whatever, they look a lot like the same thing. We took a 100-year detour around this idea, but what we've learned in the past 10 years is neurobiologically, these are very similar states. The knobs and levers being tweaked in the brain are pretty much the same. There are slight differences for sure, but they're pretty much the same state. So what we started to realize is there was a giant revolution going on in people utilizing non-ordinary states of consciousness to massively up-level performance. And because it was taking place in these disparate groups, and because most people don't know about the neurobiology, they don't realize these are the same things, nobody was talking to each other, right? Flow was artists and athletes for the past 100 years. Meditative states was mostly saints and seekers, right? Psychedelic states was hippies and ravers. None of these groups talked to each other. They didn't like each other. They didn't think about each other. And nobody definitely was talking to the Dave Asprey biohacking crowd. You know what I mean? Like none of these communicating or the Navy SEALs, but they were all doing the same thing. And if you start working the numbers on it, looking at the amount of people involved, you're looking at a giant revolution that nobody's talking about. But if you know where to look, it's almost everywhere you look. So that's sort of the book came from. Oh my God, we got to tell people about this, and figure out what it means. And more than anything, we lit out on a giant adventure to meet as many people as we possibly could who were doing this. And it took us, deep into business. We were with Richard Branson on Necker Island. It took us to the Googleplex. It took us to the Navy SEALs, and it took us all over the place. So that's what the book is.
So that doesn't sound like work at all to me.
I have nothing to say to that.
I'm just kidding. It sounds awesome. It
was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
It was a lot of fun, and we met fantastic people doing mind-blowing cutting-edge research along the way. Some of the stuff is so much farther along than you can possibly believe. That was the other thing, right? Like we uncovered 4 forces that are driving it forward, and it very, very, very quickly.
Did you find that through your research and being with all of these different groups, did you find, especially like in that endurance space or Wall Street, where they were performing these acts or these incredible feats of fitness or performance mentally and physically, did you find that they truly didn't understand or recognize that they were chasing a flow state? It was just a byproduct of continuing to push the boundaries, and therefore obviously they're reducing these states, but they didn't really make the connection of, this is why I continue to do it. This is why the boundaries kind of naturally continue to get pushed.
It's a great question, and there's no one answer, right? Every individual we met was very, very different. I will say, at Wall Street especially, but a couple other places, they're really aware of what they're doing. There's high performance has been on Wall Street for a little while now, and they're really aware of what's going on in the tech community. It depends on the technique. Meditation's obviously been there for a while, things along those lines. Everybody knows they're going to Burning Man there's overlap. They know what those feelings are. Maybe the last couple pieces haven't gone into place. And then, there are obviously, we've had the opportunity to be kind of in Europe, in Asia, all over the world. I got to tell you something, by the way. I just spent a week in Dubai, and I was with, I was speaking at the World Government Summit, and I was talking about flow as an altered state of consciousness as a way to produce agile government in the 21st century. And what I discovered is I have flow groupies over in the Middle East. And they were very familiar with my work. Some of them, a lot of people come in through Abundance or Bold and the work on innovation, but they, Bold talked about flow and they kept going into Rise. And, I was really shocked by how conversant people were in the topic. So they may not, there may be a bit or two in the language still missing, but I think this is like somehow, and I'm not sure how, this has become a mainstream conversation. There's a chapter in the book called High Times on Main Street. I think that's kind of, where we are, whether or not we're talking about it. Some of the I'm not 100% certain people understand that, like, the huge burst in interest in sexuality, like the 50 Shades of Grey revolution. Mm-hmm. I don't think people put the dots together and gone, oh, wow, this kind of sexuality produces very powerful, potent, altered states of consciousness. Obviously, that's been, anything about Tantra, there's nothing new here, right? That's an age-old tradition. That stuff may be the missing link that people start to connect with Stealing Fire. But I think there's a general awareness that I'm doing something powerful to my consciousness, and it has a massive impact on things like creativity and performance and anxiety and things along those lines.
Yeah, a couple of the stats that just blew my mind was that financial study that y'all did that said this was a $4 trillion industry. And then you hear those quotes from people like Tim Ferriss, who says every billionaire he knows in Silicon Valley is microdosing with some sort of, psychedelic. But I want to go back to some of that vocabulary you were talking about, just to define some terms for our listeners that maybe they're not familiar with flow or ecstasis. So maybe just describe for us, what is ecstasis, and then what that consists of.
So when we were trying to figure out what to call all this, right, flow is one altered state of consciousness. We are talking about a spectrum of, a chunk of the altered state spectrum, sort of the chunk that I talk about as north of happy, right? And we didn't know what to call it. We thought altered states was a very loaded word. We kind of like non-ordinary states of consciousness, which is Johns Hopkins neuropsychologist Stan Grof's term. But again, it's a little academic. And we were at the Navy SEALs, and one of the commanders of SEAL Team 6 used the term ecstasis, which he colloquially, they called it flipping the switch, but he used the term. And ecstasis is it's a Greek term, and it literally means to stand outside oneself and to be filled with information and inspiration. And all of the states we're talking about, contemplative states, meditative states, psychedelic states, flow states, what they all share in common, among a couple other things, is they do make our sense of self disappear. So we stand outside ourselves and we change the channel on normal waking consciousness. And all of these states are information-rich states. We get access. Well, basically what happens is all of the brain's pattern information processing software gets massively jacked up, right? We take in more information per second. We pay more attention to it. Salience goes up. Pattern recognition goes up, so we link it together with older ideas. Lateral thinking goes up. That's far-flung ideas that we're linking together, creating those aha moments. So these are, in a sense, altered states, the argument we make in the end, especially ecstatic states, are essentially an information technology. So if you're talking about self-disappearing and information increasing, it fit the Greek definition perfectly. And once you can sort of get past the ecstasy club drug reference, right, which we thought was the least harmful of all the references that we could get to, it made sense to use. It also made sense to sort of try to change a little bit of the vocabulary, because we wanted people to be able to read it, right, to not get hung up on any preconceived notions and just give us the benefit of the doubt for 250 pages, and then you can make up your own mind. But we wanted a term that just didn't turn off tons of groups of people. So ecstasis was our category for a larger category of non-ordinary states of consciousness. Flow is a subcategory, right? Flow specifically refers to an optimal state of consciousness where we perform our best and we feel our best. But, it's one of these many categories that come in.
are there benefits to trying to pursue a state of flow for prolonged periods of time? Because, you know, it obviously brings up these questions of like the Limitless Pill or the movie with Bradley Cooper and things like that. I think people really associate these states of flow or higher points of consciousness with those type of scenarios, right? And it can bring those dogmas or stigmas or preconceived ideas. Is it something you want to access all the time?
So I want to start with the woman who wrote Limitless is a friend of mine. And I tell her every time I talk to her that she's an enormous pain in my ass. Okay, so I wanted to start there. The second thing to know is you cannot live in a constant state of flow. In fact, once a month, I would say somebody comes up to me and they say, "Oh my God, you got to study me. I'm always in flow." And I always say the same thing, which is, it's interesting because, you know, there's another word for that. We often call that schizophrenia. You don't get to live in a flow state. And the reason is flow is a cycle. It's a 4-stage process, and you have to move through each stage where you can restart the cycle. Only one of those stages is the flow state itself. More importantly, these states, the flow, like all these states, it's expensive for the brain to produce. And so it requires energy, vitamins, minerals, sunlight, etc. You burn through that during the flow state, right? Flow is a big high. It tends to be followed by a low. That's because you've burned out all your feel-good neurochemistry and you've exhausted your brain. And there's a recovery period on the back end, as with most of these states. So a permanent state of flow does not seem possible at all, nor is it beneficial. And one of the reasons I say that is just simply, let's talk about flow. Like all non-ordinary states, it's a huge impact on creativity. Depending on whose numbers you want to go by, it's somewhere to 200 to 700% boost in creativity. And that heightened creativity actually outlasts the flow state by a couple of days. But that said, you get a shit ton of ideas in flow, right? You get flooded. Not all of them are great. You want that sober refractory period on the back end to look over your ideas and go, okay, what's a keeper? What do I throw out? I love to write in flow and edit in that low, because if I still like it in that low, I know it's great, right? That's how I use it. Now, that said, it is extremely easy, we have discovered, to create a high flow lifestyle. Meaning, like, even if you go to the work we did at Google last year was a 6-week joint learning project where we trained up a team of engineers. In 6 weeks, we got a 35 to 70% increase in flow. We just got data back from last year in our Flow Fundamentals course, which is 6 weeks online. Actually, a little more intensive than when we did Google, because we had more time. People were a little less busy, and we can ask a little bit more of them. And we had wider access to different technology, because when we were working with Google, we had to stay within their technology. And we find on average a 70% increase in flow just from an online class, which, you know, if you would talk to me 2 years ago, I would have told you you were nuts. There's no way. You know what I mean? Like, our online course is going to give you a 70% boost in flow. You're crazy. But it turns out the thing that we've learned over these past 3 or 4 years is this stuff is really trainable, right? Not, you know, it still has, there's dangers, there's downsides. This isn't just positive psychology where everything's happy, right? There's things to be concerned about along this path, but it does seem that it's possible for everyone.
I like what you said about just touching on the creativity part. In the book, you say that it's not a skill, but it's actually a state of mind. Now, how did you arrive at that conclusion? And when you say there is a 200% increase in creativity, how are you guys measuring that?
Those are both great questions. I'll start. So let's just start with what we know and how this works, okay? Sure. So in these states, 2 things happen, right? One, the self disappears. That happens because your prefrontal cortex, part of your brain that's right back here, which generates most of your higher cognitive functions, sense of morality, sense of will, complex decision-making, long-term planning, deactivates. It shuts down, gets quiet. It's an efficiency exchange. Really, the brain is trading non-critical energy for focus and attention. But in the process, prefrontal cortex turns off. Self is created all over the prefrontal cortex, so your self goes quiet. When the self goes quiet, the inner critic, that nagging, always on defeatist voice in your head, shuts up, right? goes silent, and that doesn't happen very often. When the inner critic goes silent, one of the things that happens is creativity goes through the roof and risk-taking goes through the roof, because you're no longer judging all of your ideas so harshly, right? You're just coming out. Simultaneously, you get 5 of the most potent neurochemicals the brain can produce: norepinephrine, dopamine, serotonin, anandamide, endorphin, sometimes oxytocin. These chemicals do a lot of things in the brain. They all impact information processing. Norepinephrine and dopamine enhance focus, so you take in more information per second. Enhance salience, you pay more attention to that information. And they lower signal-to-noise ratios, so you make easier connections between ideas. Anandamide boosts lateral thinking, and so forth. So all of these things sort of surround the creative process. There's lots of different types of creativity, obviously, but under the hood, it's always a recombinatory process. It's new ideas coming in, bumping into old thoughts to create something like startling new. That's how it works every place along the way. And so these things are surrounded. So to give you an example of how they measured it, and this is a really cool experiment, it was done at the University of Sydney. They took a group of 46 people and they gave them the classic test of creative problem solving, which is the 9-dot problem. Connect 9 dots with 3 lines in 10 minutes or less. Under normal conditions, less than 5% of the population pulls it off. And in their group, nobody did. They then took a different group. They used transcranial magnetic stimulation. They shot a weak magnetic pulse through people's prefrontal cortex. They knocked it out and used a temporary 20 to 40 minute flow state. And they re-administered the same test. 46% solved the test in record time. So
That's huge.
That's a huge. Also, if you look at James Fadiman's studies on microdosing in creatives, right, which have been going on since the 60s, sort of more off than on, because there was a big period that was illegal. But he started back then, some of the early research, and he's continued. And, for 50 years now, giving people subjective tests afterwards, how much of a boost in creativity do you see? 200% is the most common answer. So there's a lot of different ways. We've used subjective creativity questionnaires, post-flow. I'm working right now with Scott Barry Kaufman at the University of Pennsylvania, a positive psychologist, and we're trying to get a very accurate kind of creativity metric. We're not sure, but we won't release it online because we can get big data sets really fast. That's one of the things we've found. So even if it's a little bit of a squishy question, like how much of a boost in creativity did you notice when your consciousness was altered? If you can get 100,000 people to answer that question, you can sort of start to trust the answers.
Sure. No, that's a great answer. It actually reminds me of, I brought this up to Josh earlier about this underground movement. I'm sure you're familiar with in the hip hop community and the rap community about this purple drink, this lean, where it's a mix of, codeine and cough syrup and sometimes candy or whatever else. But these rappers, they only write their music when they're on that. They say they're most creative when they're under the influence. So it just kind of reminded me of that. Just people trying to be, they're their most creative in those states.
One thing I should mention, since you brought up hip hop, is some of the earliest research into flow was done on rappers.
Really?
It's really, they started with jazz musicians, and it took them forever to figure out how do you put an instrument into an fMRI. You can't have any metal in there, right? So they had to build a keyboard with no metal parts at Johns Hopkins. A guy named Charles Lim did this at Johns Hopkins, and that was his first study. His second study was like, fuck that. I don't want to do that again. Get rappers. They don't need anything, right? They were looking at their brains when they were, rapping lyrics they knew, Fear of Black Planet from the script, or freestyling. Freestyling obviously producing way more flow versus, and so they did imaging studies on rappers. It was I think the second big group to get imaged.
Wow. This is by no way an endorsement to start drinking purple drinks.
No, but it is whatever works. I mean, I think that's the point of the book, though.
Sure.
Not the purple drink, but the point of the book is, everybody does these things for performance. And because of what's gone on in the science right now, we have found ways to do this much more safely, with much more precision, getting the exact results we want when we want them, with less of the downside. And I'm not saying there's a downside to purple drink. I've never tried the purple drink, and B, I'm not much to judge on these things, because I've certainly tried plenty of other things. I'm glad that the information is out there at this point, because we can start to make informed choices, and we could take better risks, right? We can,
right. Stephen, I wanted to ask about removing the self. This is talked a lot about in your books, and especially Stilling Fire, and a lot in relation to mindfulness and meditation practice. But for people out there, what is the main purpose that we would want to remove the self in that moment, other than just this performance productivity enhancement? And what builds our self-identity in the first place?
Those are both great questions. We'll start with your second one. We'll build your self-identity more important. And the answer to that is, we are not 100% certain at all what builds our self-identity. But here's what we know, and it started. Most of this came out of disease work early, right? Somebody would have a stroke or brain damage to a certain part of the brain, or they'd take a bullet through a part of their brain, and we would see what happened afterwards. That's where it started, right? Then we came in with imaging, and we started to be able to, turn off parts of the brain, and go at it that way. So self seems to be localized primarily in the prefrontal cortex, and there are 7 to 10 different structures, maybe more, that have been associated with it. But the way to think about this, and the way to think about the brain, and what we know today, is almost everything is a network in the brain, right? And that's how it works. And like all networks, they're fragile. So when you've got something like self, and there's 7 structures generating it, all you gotta do is shut down a couple of nodes in that network, and we lose that ability to create our sense of self. Not a big surprise. We do it every night as we fall asleep, right? The self goes away as we go to sleep. The thing that's also interesting, because it's not just the self. Time is also calculated all over your prefrontal cortex, right? So as it shuts out, we lose the ability to separate past from present from future, plunged into what psychologists call the deep now, a totally engaged present. This combination is really important. As I said earlier, when our sense of self goes away, the inner critic shuts up, right? So a lot of fear and anxiety goes away. Simultaneously with time, most of our fears are, unless you're in immediate danger, are things in the past that happened, you want to avoid them happening again, or things in the future that you're scared of, right? So when those things go away, anxiety massively drops. So nothing else yet said, if you look at the psychological statistics for America, we are tired, wired, and stressed. 1 out of 4 of us are on anti-anxiety or antidepressant medicines. That's enormous. Suicide rates for people ages 10 to 78 are 30-year highs and climbing still. You got to stop and think about what it takes a 10-year-old to kill themselves, right? So what we know across the boards with these non-ordinary states is that they have a massive impact on fear and anxiety. They lower it significantly. And by the way, as you move into these states, not only do stress hormones, cortisol and norepinephrine, which are almost constant in the 21st century, they get flushed out of your system, and they get replaced by feel-good performance-enhancing neurochemicals. Your nervous system it literally resets back to 0, which is a really big deal. And this is why, in the book, one of the things we do is we talk about, we compare 3 side-by-side PTSD studies that have gone on in the past 5 years, which is an extreme example of, how this can help mental fitness. These are people who are at the kind of the extreme edge of fear and anxiety, but studies going back to 2012 show that in soldiers with PTSD or victims of child abuse or sexual trauma, 1 to 3 treatments with MDMA, street version of the pharmaceutical version of ecstasy, is enough to completely cure and remove symptoms of PTSD. That's big news. They redid that study with surfing and soldiers with PTSD, right? They replaced The psychedelic with surfing, which produces a lot of flow. It's a sport packed with flow triggers. They also use talk therapy like they use with the MDMA. They got the exact same results, this time with 5 weeks of surfing. They then did the study again, this time replacing surfing with meditation. They got the same results after 4 weeks of meditation. So you've got comparative techniques of ecstasy, all with a huge impact on our nervous system, and probably the people on the planet with the worst, nervous system. And mind you, a lot of 25 million Americans at any one time suffer PTSD. That's a lot. It's almost 1 out of 10 of us. So it's a big swatch of the population who this stuff provides immediate relief to. And the FDA is now looking at all these techniques as treatments for depression and anxiety in all of us. Really exciting research, and I think really pretty needed.
Yeah, that's a big step forward. But I want to get into some of the nuts and bolts here. Let's just take, for example, just flow to kind of, keep it simple. We'll just keep it just to flow. What are some of the techniques, that are used that are the most efficient at inducing flow? And I'm sure it's different for different people. We all get into it in different ways. I know you guys have said before that's ubiquitous, right? But so one, how would I find out, how I personally get into flow? And then how that differs from, say, Josh, and then what techniques, for each type of person, would we employ from there?
Good question, Jake. So, and I don't know about Josh. He may be a lost cause, but
yeah, a lot of times.
Help everybody else. You are right. Flow is ubiquitous. All these states are ubiquitous, right? We're all hardwired for them. What we've learned about flow is, simply put, there are 20 flow triggers that we know of. There are 10 flow triggers that'll drive an individual into flow. There's also something called group flows, when a whole team gets into a flow state together. We've seen this. We've taken part in a great brainstorming session where the ideas are bouncing around. That's group flow in action. If you've ever seen when a band comes together and music, sells, or if you saw the Super Bowl and watched what the Patriots did in the fourth quarter, that's group flow in action, right? So there are 10 group flow triggers. And I can talk a little bit about how individual ones work for you. But the first thing to know is the easiest, which is flow, like all these states, requires intense focus in the present moment, in the right here, right now. So that's really what these triggers do. They drive attention into the present moment. If you wanted to put it a little more formally, you'd say, hey, these 20 things are the things that evolution shaped our brain to pay the most attention to. Now, caveat, there's way more than 20. We found 20, right? Nobody's really taken a deep look at sex. We know sex produces flow. Is it lust? Is it sex? Is it skin talk? Is it like what? We know frame rate, how fast things move past your eyes. That's probably another flow trigger, again, for evolutionary reasons, because not often do things move fast, right? So we know those two things are areas of ongoing research. There's a ton more. And as you pointed out, the reason it's individual is it's genetic, right? There's genetic components here, and we're all slightly wired differently. How active or inactive your dopamine receptors are, for example, will set your risk profile. That will determine a lot of this stuff. To get to your second question, where can somebody start? Easiest place, free, simple, go to the Flow Genome Project website. If you go to flowgenomeproject.com, there's a free flow profile. I can't talk, sorry guys. It's a traitology. It says if you're this kind of person, you're likely to find the most flow in these directions. It's become, over the past couple of years, the largest study ever run in optimal psych. So it's a huge data set, and seems very, very effective. We're even seeing it being imported. We're working with a school in Minneapolis that is they're giving their fifth graders this test, and starting there and assigning them flow profile based projects so they can train in whatever area is most likely to produce flow for them. So we've seen it work kind of for all ages across the board. That's a really great place to start. It's the easiest place to start. As you get more familiar with the triggers, there's lots of ways to work with it that way. And again, not only will those triggers differ for individuals, they'll also differ for you week to week, how much energy you got, how what you feel like. Some days you want to take a risk, you're totally down. Some days you'd rather be creative. Both are options, right? Both will work just as well. So it's individual, and I think it's moment by moment. The most important thing is there's no one way, right? There's no one path to greatness. So what's most important is figure out what's authentic, what's real for you, what works for you, and run the experiment.
Now, Stephen, when you say triggers, are you referring to these triggers ranging from technology to physical? I mean, what do these actual triggers kind of look like?
So just a couple quick examples. We spent a lot of time studying action adventure sport athletes, both in Stealing Fire, there's some, and in Rise of Superman. And one of the reasons is because action adventure sport athletes are very, very good at getting into flow. They really need flow to perform, not go to the hospital, not go home in a body bag, that sort of thing. So we spent a lot of time over a decade working with action adventure sport athletes trying to figure out what this was. And so what we found with them is they rely on 3 triggers. These are external triggers, environmental triggers. The first, and we already mentioned, is high consequences. Flow follows focus, consequences catch our attention. The important thing to note is, the action adventure sport athletes rely on physical consequences, right? It doesn't matter. Social risk, emotional risk, intellectual risk, creative risk, all this stuff works just as well depending on your pleasure, right? You see a lot of sort of creative risk-taking in coding. Coders get into flow all the time. It's very common, right? And it's creative risk-taking. You don't want to screw up a line of code, right? You gotta take the chance, but you don't want to screw up the line of code. Sorry about that. So you see a lot of creative risk-taking that way. The second thing that they rely on is a rich environment, which is a fancy way of saying lots of novelty, lots of complexity, lots of unpredictability. All 3 of these things grab hold of our attention, drive focus into the now, right? They spike dopamine, the focusing drug. But again, you can see the same thing in any environment. We do a lot of work with varying organizations, and you can build novelty, complexity, and unpredictability into your office design. Tony Hsieh with the Downtown Vegas project, right, from Zappos in downtown Vegas, he wants to increase the amount of creativity, flow, and innovation in downtown Vegas. So he's designed the entire city to amplify novelty, complexity, and unpredictability. So you can have these triggers anywhere. The last one is what's known as a deep embodiment, which is a fancy way of saying you're moving your body, you're paying attention to multiple sensory streams at once. The action sport athletes, this was super important because as they were moving their body, they were encountering 0 Gs, multiple Gs, or polyaxial rotation, spinning. As gravity-bound creatures, we're not used to weightlessness or weightedness or spinning, and those things, those feelings, those sensations grab hold of our attention. But you can do this any which way. Montessori education is actually really high in flow. When they went looking for really high flow environments outside of action sports, one of the things they found is Montessori education, which is often called embodied education. Why? They emphasize learning through doing. So don't just read about the windmill, go out and build one. And, as a result, you're using your eyes, your ears, your hands, all that, engaging multiple senses, catch hold of your attention, massively increases flow. And as a result, one of the other things that happens in flow is learning is very enhanced, huge spike in learning. Which is one of the reasons why Montessori kids always outperform everybody else on every test you could possibly imagine giving them.
Now, is there certain techniques that will induce virtually anybody into flow? Like in your Google study, y'all were using the low magnetic pulse to induce that hypofrontality. And whenever I first read that, I was like, man, I need one of these machines like for myself, that I can use. Or other implications, I was thinking, man, if I'm an MLB pitcher, I'm gonna have this on in the bullpen before I go take the mound. Is there?
I will tell you, radar operators are using it. Some of the early research on transcranial was done on radar operators, so that is becoming very, very, very common inside the military and out to see radar operators using transcranial. And Wall Street seems to particularly like that technique as well. Tim Ferriss once pointed out to me that you have to get it right. If you're trying this yourself, you have to get it right, or you can make yourself really stupid for a little bit. You can get it wrong. Personally, I'm maybe I'm a little more low tech. Maybe I don't care like carrying around a lot of gear. I mean, I certainly, action sports are my favorite way into these states, and, that comes with some gear, but like, it is very easy to breathe yourself into these states. You could do it really, really, really fast. So starting with a little kind of mindfulness practice, some breath work. I would do something interesting and aggressive, like, box breathing or a breath of fire, or combine the two that really, produces a powerful state shift. But, I think you can get to similar places with 7 to 10 minutes of box breathing. Even when I ski now, I do box breathing on the chairlift.
Oh, really?
Between runs, yeah, a lot. Or before meetings, or, if I have to go give a speech, I'm always in the bathroom, sitting in the can, doing like a couple minutes of box breathing before I go on stage.
Yeah. Are you using utilizing the power pose as well?
Sometimes I'll use the power pose as well, which I probably should integrate more. But I do it when I'm, in the elevator. I tend to stand like Wonder Woman in the elevator, in the bathroom.
Absolutely. Yeah, Jake and I were actually talking about that last night. That was a question I wanted to bring up, was about the breathing techniques. Because fire breathing, you can definitely get that sense of, for lack of a better term, high, if you will. Intense focus, kind of euphoria. Yeah, it seems to work really well. So I wanted to run that by you.
Yeah, I mean, certainly Wim Hof with his, hyperventilation version of Breath of Fire is getting some amazing results. Stan Grof, when he, developed holotropic breath work, because when LSD got banned and he was doing all kinds of psychedelic research, he developed holotropic breath work because it produces almost the exact same, you basically can have the same kind of acid trip, very powerful serotonin release in the brain using breath work. It does take about 3 hours of breathing to get there. So you can get sort of like a nitrous oxide, like a whippet response in about 25 minutes using those breath techniques. And, I learned Breath of Fire in, years of Ashtanga yoga. So that's what I use because it's just easy for me. But box breathing is what I lean on the most. It's what we teach at FGP. It's the first thing we teach. It has some really neat additional features besides the calm, some things that I think help flow long term. So,
and this is are you tracing a box?
Right.
4 seconds, 4-second hold.
Exactly.
Yeah.
5 seconds in, 5 seconds hold, 5 seconds out, 5 seconds hold, and up to like 10 seconds if you can. And it does a number of things. Right, the Navy SEALs use it a lot, both because it expands lung capacity for sure over time, and you see with both Breath of Fire and box breathing, especially if you're combining them. Brian McKenzie discovered that you can get enhanced cardio fitness just through these breathing techniques. So you don't have to run as much. You can just kind of breathe. But the other thing is, when you exhale all the air from your lungs and you hold your breath for more than 7 seconds, it automatically induces a fight or flight response. You panic. And so what you learn to do is focus through the panic, quiet that down. If you're interested in flow, that's great for flow, right? Because that's oftentimes, especially for action sport athletes or people, Wall Street traders who are in high stress situations, they have to make very quick decisions, right? That you have to focus through the panic. And so it's very useful to do that. It's also, for anybody else, if you can learn to kind of downregulate your nervous system in this way, you get small gaps. You get powerful emotions come up. There's a tiny little gap, right? Before you notice it, you're like, oh crap, that's a lot of rage. And you have a second, right? You have a second to make a decision. Do I want to feel this? Or maybe not so much today. Maybe this isn't a good idea. And under normal circumstances, rage comes up. You've got no choice. It's an altered state of consciousness in and of itself, right? It takes over. So you want that little gap that says, hey man, this is a choice. You can decide whatever you want to do here. So I find box breathing is really good for all three of those things.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, it almost sounds too good to be true, saying that I can get into this state just by breathing in 5 to 7 minutes. But what's the secret to maintaining that state of flow? That almost seems harder than just getting there itself.
Well, again, I mean, so flow, there's no one measure, how long does it last kind of thing, right? Differs for varying people, may differ for different kind of flow states. For example, average flow state usually comes in an hour to an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours. But helper's high, which is an altruism-induced flow state discovered by Alan Lukes, who runs Big Brothers Big Sisters back in the 90s, can sometimes last 2 days. So go figure. I had, and there's, you know, I've had experiences, especially writing one of my early books, Small Furry Prayer. I wrote in a mostly nonstop 2-week flow state. I would pop out of it at the end of the day, eat my dinner, pass out, fall asleep, talk to my wife, you know, and come back, start working the next morning and start writing and drop right back in and sustain. You see that with startups, right? Startup teams they fall into group flow a lot, and they'll manage to sustain it for like the 3 months up to launch. So those things seem to be common as well. But you know, to maintain it over long periods of time, you know, you need to be recovering deeply. You know, more than anything, which is a lot of what most people leave out of the equation, really critically important. There is a recovery phase on the back end of a flow state. So just what I do at the end of every day, we have a sauna in our house. So I spend an hour in the sauna. I do a lot of all the box breathing meditation stuff that we've been talking about. That gets done in the sauna. So, and you know, and we really prioritize sleep at the Flow Genome Project. One of the first things we do when we go into organizations, we put everybody on a sleep monitor. So you know, 7 hours, these are expensive states to produce. You get a lot more work done, right? McKinsey did a 10-year study on flow, and they found top executives were 5 times more productive, or 500% more productive in flow. So much, you can get so much done, right? In these small windows, in these states, that you end up with more time, but you have to prioritize recovery. One of the things we say all the time, FGP, is with this stuff, you got to go slow to go fast, which is really important. You go A to B far quicker using these techniques, but you really do have to go slow. You have to spend a lot. You have to privilege recovery. I always say that, you know, flow requires a lot of grit, or these states require a lot of grit. And one of the levels of grit that is really important is the grit to recover, which high performers suck at as a general rule. High performers do not, myself included, like to recover. Right? You want to go from one thing to the next. You know, we see it a lot. Really, you see it a lot in companies. Sales is particularly brutal on this, because what will happen is somebody will, you know, have a really great month, a lot of flow states. They'll blow it out of the water. They'll sell a ton of shit. They'll break all their quotas, and the month will end, and the boss will say, "That was fantastic. That was awesome. Now do it again in 2 weeks, and we're gonna shrink your territory in half." Right? And that happens all the time. It happens, you know, in companies. People get through like an amazing project together, do a kick-ass job. Boss says, "That was amazing. That was kick-ass. Great job. Now I need you to do this project right now." There's no time for recovery, and usually because the next thing is more difficult, there's greater challenge, and the combination is deadly.
Stephen, do you ever find, is it possible to induce flow through routine? And I asked that from my competitive golf days. The only coach I had was primarily a psychological coach, and there was very little work on the physical, golf swing, etc. And it was all focused on the mental, whether that was on the range or course practice. And it was all about the process and setting up the process so that you could shut it off and routine would take over. The golf swing didn't matter. Nothing mattered. The state of your mind is all that mattered. And so have you had any experience with being able to induce flow through these setup processes or routines?
Yeah, it's a great question. And yes, there's been a lot of that. It's important. One of the things that we talk about a lot is protecting the first 90 minutes of your day, for example, which is a very high flow time. And you want to use it for your hardest task, whatever you need most. And you know, it sort of goes from there. But yeah, I think you want to make it as much of your life as is possible steady and even and familiar, and I know what I'm going to do. I know what I'm going to do next. So you don't have to worry about it. You can take that stuff out of the picture. It's really useful. By the way, You're not doing anything different in that question than what Google is doing when they provide people with free dry cleaning and rides to work and rides home on the weekends and to the rock concert and and food and everything else. They're doing the same thing, right? They're to maximize flow. Every time the self has to come into the picture and do some thinking, right? You're knocking yourself farther from this state. So anything you can do to keep that portion of the brain shut down, very useful.
That's good to know. And I know you guys kind of have cornered the market as far as, flow goes and flow research and everything. So there might not be an answer to this question, but what's some of the worst advice that you hear being, spewed out there about flow states? Or maybe there's just misconceptions.
That's a funny question. Yeah. Well, I do think oftentimes there are a lot of people who do think flow can be achieved 24/7, and right, there are different, and there's interesting enlightenment research going on. We talk about it a little bit in Stealing Fire, and it's really, it's again hard. Enlightenment seems to be this permanent state, but the more we look at it, the more it seems like what you've managed to do is retain the perspective you have in a non-ordinary state during normal life, not the sensation. So that seems slightly possible, but you hear a lot of people talk about you can live in flow, and it's ridiculous. B, you wouldn't want to do it. I always say with these states, like the value, these are information-rich states, but to get information, you need contrast, right? You don't want, if everything's the same, you're not going to notice it. So you want the contrast in the state, out of the state. So I hear oftentimes people trying to live in flow, and it creates it's not possible, and B, it's a ridiculous expectation. C, you wouldn't want to be there. So I think that is consistently what we see. The other thing that has gone on with all these kind of non-ordinary states, these are high energy states. There are consequences for playing with them, and even flow. And I see a lot of people kind of not taking the risk side of this, right? Big ups, huge boosts, creativity, learning, motivation, heal anxiety, heal trauma, magic wonder pill, fantastic. There are downsides, there are dark sides. These states are very sticky, right? They can be addictive. They can cause you to think these things go wrong. In fact, Stealing Fire, at the end of the book, we lay down 4 case studies for how these things go wrong consistently throughout history, over and over and over again. People are still going to make those same mistakes. They're still going to go down those rabbit holes. So not thinking these things can be dangerous, so not treating them with a lot of respect. Nobody would take, or very few people take drugs, psychedelics, for example, without a little bit that you treat that stuff with respect. You should have the same respect for meditation, for flow, they come with cautions, and you have to be an adult about this stuff, especially if you want to sustain it over time. And the idea that this can be permanent, that to me is the big error.
Right. And you kind of bring up there almost the nootropic category, which is becoming even more widespread and continued growth, and kind of fits in line with, I guess, our society of always reaching for that pill that's going to get me to this state, when simple box breathing or binaural beats or anything like that might do the job. Are there any other technology options that are readily accessible that people can tap into, like a binaural beats or something like that?
We've done some work. Focus at Will and Brain FM both are music, right? Both are using sound to drive flow. Both are getting amazing results. So those are neat techs, and we're seeing this develop more. I really personally, heart rate variability seems to be, it's not a single data point. There's a lot of people make a mistake with heart rate variability and conflate it with flow or conflate it with these states. It's not, but it's a very good tool. I love neurofeedback, and there are so many prosumer, the Muse headset I really like, but there are so many prosumer devices out there right now. And the important point is you want to mix and match. You want to use a lot of stuff that's available to you. You want to run the experiment for yourself and figure out what really works for you. Personally, you know, a lot of people in the Flow Genome Project love the technology. They're really for it, and they get great results with neural feedback and brainwave entrainment and all this sort of stuff. I don't like any of it. It's not, personally, I'm a low tech guy. I like to be able to do something like with just me and nothing else. So that's how I approach it, because I want to be able to do it under any circumstances, wherever I am, whenever I am, you know, for no apparent good reason other than that's how I'm wired, right? Like, but everybody's different, and you should, you know, really run different experiments. I think the mistake is I have to get there right here, right now, today. This is a long practice. You know, I do a lot of speaking, and corporations always want to know, what are the 3 things we can do Monday morning? Right? And, you know, absolutely, I can give you 3 things to do Monday morning, but you're also going to have to do them Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday and Friday and Saturday and Sunday and Monday and Tuesday, right? I mean, like, for sure, that's what matters. What matters is, you know, we teach people to do a power hour of work at FGP, 1 hour a day, committed to sort of some of these practices, to the, you know, a limited set of these practices. But if you do it every day, you start to get results. But you want to keep doing it. Like, you don't, I mean, it just doesn't make sense to stop. You know what I mean? Like, and you see a lot of people, that's the other, you asked me about bad advice. There's a lot of people who want us to get there now really fast. Okay, go right ahead. It's totally fine. I understand your impatience. I am deeply impatient myself, and I absolutely sympathize. But if you go slow to go fast, you will go much farther faster.
Reminds me a lot of one of the first meditation books I read, which was 10% Happier by Dan Harris. And it's just that constant practice. You know, it's a great book, recommend to anybody out there interested in learning about mindfulness. But I wanted to ask you, you mentioned that the heart rate variability, and that's a tool we've used for years. And in fact, we had Jason Moore, the creator of Elite HRV, on the podcast a while back. But I'm not very familiar on inducing flow states with HRV. Could you highlight a little bit some of those techniques or what they're actually doing?
Yeah, I mean, by the way, I do not think it completely induces flow states. There are different organizations who think that if you can use that. What I think is that learning to calm yourself down very, very quickly is very, very useful. And I think if you use heart rate variability, which can calm you down, lower anxiety, right? There's a sweet spot for flow where anxiety, the quieter your anxiety is, the easier it's going to be to get to that sweet spot most of the time, provided you're paying some attention. So I think heart rate variability combined with neural feedback, really potent. And that's when I'm seeing it tend to produce flow states. People are using it that way. It's that combination. I don't think you can get there with one. I think it's a potent technology with a meditation, with a breathing practice, you know, just deployed. Anything you can do to train the brain to focus and calm down is going to train up these skill sets.
So it's almost using that part of the app, just to use the Elite HRV, for example, the breathing technique part, where you're breathing and you're following a circle that's changing colors as your breath is inhaling, exhaling.
Now, how about on the nutrition side of things? I know Josh and I and our business is in the performance nutrition space, and a lot of our listeners have heard us talk about this, et cetera. Are there any nutritional schemes, diets that are favorable to a flow-filled life, or on the flip side, ones that are extremely detrimental?
It's a good question. I think answer one is we don't really know. And the main reason we don't know is because seems to be different in everyone. Flow is a high energy state, so you definitely need to be fueled. It needs to be good fuel as a general rule. Fruits, vegetables, fish, the smart things to eat. That seems to really matter. Individually, it's hard to tell. I will tell you a funny story though. Personally, I spent a decade tracking flow while skiing and recording what I ate that day, how deep of a flow state I got into. that sort of thing. And I did it over a decade just to see if there was anything in the data, just at a self level. Could I learn anything? And after a decade, what I noticed is that on the days that I didn't have time to make breakfast and stopped at a gas station and ate crap trucker food of powdered donuts and coffee, that's when I got the most flow. So, and I really think that has to do with like being really skinny and burning a lot of energy quickly and just packing in, bad sugar and fat, was what I was responding to. So now now it's just a lot of fat and sugar before I go, just better sources. What I've been aiming for. But I think everybody has to run the experiment. We all, at this point, most of us, we know how to eat, right? We've sort of learned how to eat. And we've learned a lot of what's bad for us. And from there, I think you just have to run the experiment and, keep track of your data.
Good to know. How about, I know we're kind of getting close to the timer here, but how did you get onto this? I mean, you said you spent 10 years studying flow on yourself and skiing. Where did all that come from? How did you first get on this subject?
Couple of different places, but like the earliest was when I started out years ago in the early 90s, I was primarily a journalist. And action sports were brand new then. So if you could ride and ski or ride and surf, ride and rock climb, whatever, there was work. And couldn't do any of those things super well, but I liked my editors because I needed the work. And I got to spend, the better portion of 5-6 years chasing professional athletes around mountains. And one of the things that happens is if you're not a professional athlete, you chase professional athletes around mountains, is you break a lot of bones. I broke a massive amount of bones, and that would mean I took a lot of time off, right? I'd be hanging out, snap this or that, and have to take 4 or 5 months off. And when I came back, I would notice that progress was incredible. It didn't make any sense. Like stuff that had been impossible 3 months ago, not ever going to get done, was not only being done, it was being iterated upon. And it just kept happening over and over and over a period that I kept going, well, what is driving this? This is really strange. Over a period of time, I eventually figured out what this was and, started researching it more formally. But that's really where it started for me, because I started to see what it was producing, a level of progress that didn't make any sense, especially as a science geek. It's like, these guys are defying all the numbers. And you're talking about a group of people, especially action sport athletes in the 1990s, this is a punk rock crowd. They don't have a ton of education. Nobody's got a lot of money, right? And nobody is following any high performance blueprint. They're living radically wild lives. So they'd be the last group of people you would suspect in the world of massive amounts of very quick improvement. So where was it coming from was a very valid and puzzling question.
Good to know. Well, I was reading, I think it was an Outside magazine. Somebody went through your fundamentals class there on the Flow Genome Project, and he was describing an assignment that you guys gave where, you had him down 2 shots of espresso, then 2 shots of vodka, and then watch this really immersive video that he had to turn all the way up, full screen, full blast, just super immersive. And I just wanted to know if maybe you could give...
You forgot the chocolate.
The chocolate? Oh, I didn't remember the chocolate.
Yeah. We also had him eating a lot of chocolate.
A lot of chocolate?
Yeah. So one of the things that's important about this work is you need what my partner Jamie Wheel likes to call cognitive literacy. It's really important, right? When working with non-ordinary states of consciousness, flow or otherwise, to understand what these states feel like. And you need, we had to get people legally into some kind of an altered state of consciousness just so they can start experiencing different states, right? One of the things that happens very frequently, flow or otherwise, is the first handful of times people get into these states, they're so powerful, right? There's no reference. They don't use them for high performance. They're starstruck. You're just like looking around going, oh my God, it's so neat, pretty, all the trees, right? That's fine. But you want to learn to be familiar. That wants to be a place that you live and can move around and can utilize. And that takes some awareness. So that's an early exercise just to say, hey, here's a profound state change. And people have, had alcohol before, they've had chocolate and espresso before. They may not have had all these things together, so it's a slightly different version. And that was the point of that. It was also a point of, teaching people. That was a risk exercise as well. One, when we do the Flow Genome Project, we do that. This is from Flow Fundamentals. We like to give people choices. We're going to teach you how to use risk as a trigger. We're going to give you small, medium, large, right? Whatever level you're comfortable going at, you go. That was woven in there as one option. But I saw it show up in the Outside article. I kind of cringed, right? Like you had to mention that, right? Like you're really gonna seem like fruitcakes. There's no context, right? There's nothing. Just like we made you do this, but it does seem to be useful to people, right?
Sure.
You can come to one of our events. Usually one of the things we do on the first day is take people through an hour-long breathing protocol that starts, with box breathing, goes all the way up, through consciousness altering breathing into kind of sometimes nitric oxide breathing, where we're giving people essentially the gas inside a whippets or laughing gas, and using free whole breath driving practices at the same time. The interesting thing is you can, using breath of fire, if you do breath of fire for about 15, 20 minutes, you will produce a sensation in your brain that is exactly the same as what a whippet does. You'll get a nitric oxide release. So what's really interesting to me with this exercise is they do this themselves, right? They're like, oh, wow, look what I did to my brain. And then 10 minutes later, they use a chemical and do the exact same thing.
Wow.
So that's a level of cognitive literacy, some fluency in how your brain works and how it feels. That is useful.
Well, Stephen, I know we really appreciate if you wouldn't mind passing along maybe a challenge to our listeners or some resource kind of to get them down this path of reaching flow state.
Maybe we'll just call it a medium risk. Big risk for this guy. But
well, stealingfirebook.com, information-wise, great place to start there. And I don't know the challenge to your listeners is learn more about how your brain works under the hood, and how it makes you feel, right? Like that's really a lot of the ball game, is learning how to map states of consciousness and their feelings onto kind of what trigger that in me. Where did this come from? How can I get more or less of it? And that comes just through paying attention and trying to link those things together.
That's awesome. Great. We appreciate it. Before we let you go, we got to ask, how is the Chihuahua Ranch coming along? How is everything?
The whole team's still there?
Everybody, the Chihuahua, Rancho de Chihuahua is really, thank you. It's nice of you to ask. It's great. It's our, I think we're closing in on our 10-year anniversary this year.
Wow.
I think we've helped about
Congratulations.
700 dogs here, a couple 5,000 through our outreach program. So made a little bit of a dent. Long way to go.
That's great. Well, and in closing, I know the book is out. Anything you want our listeners to know on that front?
It's out. Buy 432 copies each. Really? Give them to everybody you know. Give them to people you don't even like. I would say, because you'll like them better after they read the book. So that's I'm going to shut up now.
Yeah. You will not be disappointed. I mean, it is a killer. You can get it on Amazon. You can get it on the website. And Barnes & Noble.
Any independent bookstore. Any bookstore at this point. It's everywhere.
Yeah. We'll put all the details in the show notes. And Stephen, it's been a pleasure.
Thanks, guys. Hey, thank you so much for what you do. This was really fun.
Yeah.